Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CIPR Not-for-Profit Group's webinar, Communicating Across the Digital Divide. We have a packed agenda today with a fantastic discussion lined up. We've got some excellent panelists and a wonderful host. But before we get into that too much, I would like to draw your attention to a couple of key points. First, you will see on the title slide ahead of us that we do have our Twitter handle, CIPR-NFP. We encourage live tweeting and posting to other social media platforms as well. Please do tag us on Twitter if you use that platform, but regardless of whichever platform you use, if you could also include the hashtag NFPComms, that will enable us to see what all has been tweeted or posted about the event. So just letting the room fill up a couple of moments. Would also like to draw your attention to the fact that the event is being recorded and it will be available on the CIPR CPD database in a couple of days. So do feel free to log your CPD points and to rewatch any of the discussion if you want to. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce our host or our chair for the discussion today. Harish Biyani is a founder and senior partner at PRM Diversity Consultants, which was founded in 2001. He's also a member of CIPR's Diversity and Inclusion Network, in which he contributes as a subject matter expert. I'm going to hand over to Harish now to introduce the panel and get our discussion underway. Harish?
Thank you, John. Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to be here to chair this session. I'm really looking forward to the content. We have a fantastic diverse panel for you to share their experiences about what they've been doing recently in these areas, and I think there's going to be much to learn and absorb. We have 4 panelists today, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves in a second. In terms of the format of the session, we're going to keep it really simple. I've got a couple of broad questions in mind for our panelists, and we'll follow that up with some of your specific questions and comments as well, which John will be keeping an eye on the chat as we progress, and we'll allow time towards the end of the session to pick up on some of those. So without further ado, let me pass you on to our esteemed panelists. May I ask you please to introduce yourselves? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I'm Jess Tobin. I manage the information services team at Alzheimer's Research UK.
I'm happy to go next. So I'm Anna Osborne. I'm Head of Marketing and Communications at Good Things Foundation. So we're a digital inclusion charity.
I can go now. I'm Polly Chock. I'm the Strategic Director for Engagement Culture and OD at the London Borough of Hackney.
And I think, last but not least, I'm Jo Parry, and I head up the marketing team here at the Office for National Statistics, and we were responsible for running the census campaign.
Fantastic. Thanks ever so much, folks. I'm delighted you could join us today for the session and share your valuable experience. The subject itself is one that may bring some shock and surprise to you. We had an infographic circulating among us this morning. I'm not sure if everyone's seen it yet, but we'll aim to get that out to everyone attending today as well, because I think it was quite interesting, just how significant the divide seems to be in some ways. But let's crack on with the questions. So my first question to the panelists, and I'll ask each panelist to respond in turn, spend about 5 or 6, 7 minutes or so, so we can get some detail. So maybe we start off with Joe. Joe, can you please tell us about your recent campaign which involved bridging the digital divide for your organisation, including, to the degree that you can, how you determined who's not online or has access to digital, and how the pandemic affected the divide?
Yes, no problem. So as I mentioned in my intro, I'm going to talk to you about the Census 2021 campaign that we ran in the early part of last year. And hopefully it was a campaign that you all came across and you definitely all completed your census forms on time. But basically the goal of that campaign was to encourage the best part of 27 million households across England and Wales, and also quite a significant number of what we call community establishments, by which I mean care homes, universities, prisons, to respond to the census, to complete it accurately on time, and certainly in time for Census Day, which was on the 21st of March of last year. And what we were looking for was at least a 94% response rate. That's what was achieved in 2011, and clearly we have to achieve a certain figure in order for the census results to be valid. We wanted an 80% response minimum across all of the local authorities, because obviously it doesn't work if you have one area with a 5% response rate and another with 95%. It needs to be statistically accurate and representative of the entire population. And the other target we had was to achieve at least 75% of our responses online. And this census was billed as the first digital first census, because the one that we conducted in 2011, although it was possible to respond online, and I think about 17% of the population at that time did respond online, everyone was sent a paper questionnaire. So with the census, it's absolutely critical that we get as many and as varied responses as possible, because in a way, if the census isn't right, you're kind of building in a bias and a lack of representation across all of our work. So as communicators, but as policymakers, if the figures aren't accurate and we've got kind of major gaps in representation, then it's a critical problem. And so we set out to try and devise the most inclusive campaign as possible. And the chief thing was to get people to respond in one way or another, be it via paper or online, but we did have a really vested interest in trying to encourage people online for efficiency for both sides, from our organisational perspective, but also from the perspective of users. And I think I was looking at remembering some sort of stats yesterday as I was refreshing my memory, and they calculated that we would have needed 450 million pieces of paper if everyone had completed on paper, because it was a 16-page questionnaire and we produced it in English and Welsh. So although absolutely kind of recognising the critical importance of giving as many options as possible for people, I think you can see why we were very focused on digital efficiencies and access. So that was the goal of the campaign. And just to briefly cover, because I know I've not got a lot of time, a kind of beginning, a middle and end of the campaign. Firstly, the beginning around briefly the approach to campaign research and development, the middle, the campaign design and delivery, and the end, what actually happened, what results did we get. In terms of the development, I think we were really supporting a massive operation, and so it's really important for us to link our campaign in with the operational design. But for people that want to find out a bit more about how we approached identifying who might be digitally active and who might prefer a paper approach, there is a paper on the ONS website called Designing a Digital First Census, and I'd direct you to that as a really useful resource if you don't have a paper strategy it's worth looking at that and looking at some of the ways that that was developed. It's quite complex. I'm not going to kind of delve into it here, but I think there were three key tenets of the operational model. One was that we had the most user-friendly, accessible respondent journey. The second was that we would send paper questionnaires via appropriate means for those who needed them. And we established that we needed to send out paper forms to 11% of the population of England and Wales beforehand. This was based on looking at Ofgem reports, other government interaction organisations that might be equivalent, like the DVLA, looking at digital accessibility and use, and kind of coming up with a kind of complex calculation about how many paper questionnaires we should use and to whom they should be sent. We also ran a couple of rehearsals and tested it out, and obviously there was a bias in the terms of, if you send people a paper questionnaire, they're more likely to fill it out even if they might have filled out a digital questionnaire. So there's lots of complexity in there, but I think we kind of netted out at the right number. And then the other thing was making sure that we provided loads of support for people. So we worked with the Good Things Foundation, who I know are on this call, and we had 744 support centres for people to get online and complete their census. We had support on the doorstep. We also had a telephone operation as well. We did a lot of audience research from a campaign perspective. We did an extensive segmentation, and we looked at people's ability and willingness to respond. We also then did further work around identifying key population groups with the programme, which were about 58 or so discrete groups that might speak specific languages, have certain accessibility needs, or be difficult to target in terms of, for example, if you live on a barge or you kind of have an itinerant lifestyle, you're moving around. And so we then did specific work around looking at the requirements of those key population groups, whether we could meet them with our kind of overarching highly inclusive campaign, or whether we'd also need discrete activity to target them as well. So we ended up with a core campaign and then about 30 different discrete campaigns to reach audiences, including those that were less kind of digitally savvy as part of the mix. In terms of campaign design and delivery, we tried to bring in inclusivity from the start. We had a kind of positioning of it's about us, not it's about us, the ONS, but it's about us as in it's from the population. We also ran the campaign in phases, and we made a lot of effort to stress all the different kinds of completion routes and the support available that I outlined. With such a large scale campaign and with census, you've only got one chance. You have to run it at the time you're running it. You can't really extend the deadline or abort and start again. So you have to get it right.
1 minute, Jo.
We used a host of different channels, from advertising to education programs, commercial partnerships, community engagement. There's a long list, and I'm happy to kind of go into it and the detail of that. But we also had an accessibility strand. So we produced our materials in 34 languages and in accessible formats. And as I say, we worked with the Good Things Foundation on making sure that digital support was available for people. I think in terms of looking at the characteristics of groups that might be less, more likely to use paper, we kind of narrowed it down to the over 80s and lower income households, and looked at developing specific activity for them. Just darting to the results, even in a context of declining response rates to surveys generally, and the fact that we ran this campaign during a pandemic, we got a 97% response rate, which is extremely high and puts us in a great foundation in terms of the results and research that we have going forward. The other critical result was that we got 89% of people responding digitally. So it looks like the 11% of forms that were sent out on paper neatly match. It wasn't exactly the same groups of people. It wasn't that perfect, but I think you can see that we're pretty confident that the work that was put in around the planning and around the campaign got a high response rate, got a high digital response, but also we were able to kind of capture all kinds of different groups and individuals to make for a successful census.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Joe. I think folks from that whistle stop, which I forced onto Joe there, tour, you can see the richness of detail and effort that went into that campaign. Huge numbers. Core campaign and 30 odd discrete for access, for offering access to those who aren't digital completely. Paper questionnaires, loads of support, 744 support centres I heard. A key document to designing a digital first census, I think, Joe, you called it. So please, you won't have necessarily captured all of that information live, but please look up the recording when it's made available, because there's tons of information in there, I'm sure. In the interest of time, I'm going to pass on to Anna now and ask Anna the same question. Anna, do you want me to repeat the question, or are you happy to continue?
No, I think that's fine. I'm happy to go.
Thanks, Anna.
Great stuff. So just briefly, just to tell you a little bit about Good Things Foundation. So we're a digital inclusion charity. So this is really our kind of our bag, this kind of thing. So we have been working for over a decade to fix the digital divide in the UK as it's kind of shifted and changed. And we've recently launched a new strategy with the kind of real ambition of fixing the digital divide for good. So working with partners across government, across business, and across the third sector as well, in order to kind of really come together to seize the moment and close this digital divide. And we do this through delivering 3 key services, which is the National Digital Inclusion Network, so which is a group of around 5,000 community organisations who are out there in the community supporting people to get online and improve their skills. Yes, some of those are the ones that had supported the delivery of the census last year. We also have 2 new services that we've recently launched, so a national data bank. So this is working with Virgin Media O2 and other partners to give out data to people in poverty who need, who can't afford data, and a new service for us, the National Device Bank, which is taking devices, recycling them, and giving them to people in need. So just wanted to touch on very briefly on the digitally excluded population. So we do a lot of research and collect a lot of research from other people into who the digitally excluded population are. So just for context, just to tell you a little bit about that. So in the UK at the moment, there's 10 million people who lack basic digital skills, and there are 14.9 people who have very low digital engagement. So sometimes it kind of feel like a bit of a niche issue, but actually this is something that affects a huge tranche of the population. And on top of that, 1.5 million households have no internet access and 2 million struggle to afford internet access. So these are stats from last year, will only have got worse, I'm sure, when we see the latest stats this year due to kind of current cost of living issue. So yeah, when we look at these stats again this year, I'm sure we're likely to see that have got worse. And we publish something every year called the Digital Nation, which is just a bit of a snapshot really of where we are as a digitally excluded population. So that will be coming out in September this year with the latest stats. Just a bit about who is excluded. So people who are have limited users of the internet are 4 times more likely to be from low-income households, 8 times more likely to be over 65, and 1.5 times more likely to be from BAME groups. So as you can see, kind of digitally excluded people are likely to be socially excluded too. So that's something that we take into account for all of our communications and marketing. And just to touch very briefly on the kind of how the pandemic has affected things. So we actually launched some research last week, which I can share with everybody, about the kind of economic benefits and impacts of digital inclusion. So firstly, how much it will cost to get everyone in the UK online, but then the benefits, so what it will give to kind of the UK in terms of increased tax income, saving money through online services, that kind of thing. So as part of that research, we have touched on how the pandemic has affected things. So we know more people have used the internet during the last 2 years. They've had to. So the divide has narrowed, but actually those who are excluded are more excluded than they have been previously. So if people haven't used technology in the last 2.5 years, they're even less likely to do so. And there are people that are still very limited in what they can do. So they may have kind of adopted digital technology in a very limited way because they have had to in the past 2.5 years, but they're still not included in the way we might want to be. They're not using it regularly. They're not really seeing the benefits benefits for their lives. So that's something that we're really interested in, how we kind of reach those very hard to reach people now, and through our kind of campaigns that I'll touch on, that's what we're focusing on doing. So I have a couple of campaigns I just wanted to touch on very briefly, because I know I've not got too much time. So the first is a campaign we ran with partners including Mastercard, Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Lloyds Banking Group and Clean Slate, this called Nobody in the Dark. So this was a campaign aimed at helping people on low incomes and those that were living in poverty to access digital tools to help them to better manage their money. So planning for this started in, I think, late 2019, so pre-pandemic, when it was all, before we knew anything about COVID, but actually as we came to launch in April 2020, COVID was a huge issue, and was used as a real hook to deliver some of this activity. So through that coalition of organisations, we really aim to reach out to people who were both digitally and financially excluded, and to support them with tools to help them better manage their money. So obviously it kind of came at a kind of real crunch time for those individuals who really needed some support to manage their money, with kind of challenges in their lives, and if the furlough scheme, losing work, that kind of thing, as COVID hit. So our call to action for that campaign was both online and offline. So we ran a lot of face-to-face support through our community partners, who I've mentioned. They run sessions, they engage people in their community to support them face-to-face to improve their skills and to access some of these tools. And we also ran a series of pop-up events around the country. And we also had an online portal, so online resources that people could access, so they could kind of self-serve if they were had a kind of a low level of digital skills, so they were confident doing some things online, they could access that online portal. And I think it's worth saying, in terms of kind of tactics for reaching people, that people can still be digitally excluded and use some digital tools. So we've certainly found through kind of social media and social media advertising that they can be a really effective tool to reach people whose skill level is quite low, because they do access some things online. And Facebook as a channel, for example, has been really successful for us, because we know a lot of people who in our target groups use that as a tool and as a network. So tactically, we used a kind of mix of channels and of ways to reach digitally and financially excluded people. Great. So we use real life case studies to appeal to people. So kind of building trust with people, using people, people trust people, and people like them. And we were really lucky that the Mastercard Nobody in the Dark campaign had a really generous budget. So we used some really creative kind of out of home marketing. So we lit up some tower blocks in London and Bristol with some messages from an influential poet and campaigner. But most importantly, this activity was kind of driving people to the local community-based grassroots activity. So running pop-up activity, and through the activity in our through our partner organisations, and that mix was really successful. So the national profile raising, the big kind of PR, creative out of home stuff that we did, but really coupled with the really local relationship building and one-to-one face-to-face support. So I think for us, that's kind of the key takeaway for us, is that kind of national plus local, really building that trust with people who are excluded, because they are less likely to kind of trust national messaging or mass market messaging. And I'll leave that there.
Okay, thank you, Anna. I'm really sorry to have to rush you sometimes.
No problem.
Thank you. So national and local imperatives, pop-up events, face-to-face. I imagine some of that gets quite expensive and complicated and challenging. Maybe you can cover off some of that in the Q&A later.
Yeah.
Thanks, Anna. Can I go over to Jess now and ask Jess to answer? Jess, do you want me to answer the question?
Yes, of course. Yes, so we're a bit different to kind of the other organisations that have spoke so far. So we're quite a small charity that obviously work with people with dementia. Obviously 95% of people over that have dementia over the age of 65. So it's a lot of kind of ongoing work streams to try and re-engage people living with dementia. So, and we haven't kind of got any large campaigns as such, but we do have a couple of ongoing work streams that I can talk to you about. So the first one is health information dissemination. So as an organisation, we have a suite of 17 health information booklets, which cover things from the different types of dementia, treatments, risk, and genetics. So each year we do a dissemination. So that means that we send a big mail out to either GPs, pharmacies, or memory clinics. So we try and kind of target areas where we know people that may have got a recent diagnosis or know somebody that have got a diagnosis. We know they're going to be going there for either ongoing treatment or support going forward. So an example of this, in 2019, we sent out 16,000 packs containing our newly updated booklet called What is Alzheimer's Disease? So we sent those to pharmacies in the UK, and off the back of this, we had about a 6.8% engagement rate, and we had about 50,000 leaflets ordered. One of the other kind of key work streams that we operate as a team, we support a service called Join Dementia Research, which is part of the NHS, and it's basically a matching registry for people that have a diagnosis or don't to take part in research studies that they might be suitable for. So as part of that, obviously, we support a lot of people that either don't have online access, or some people just prefer not using online, especially if they have a dementia diagnosis. They're much more likely to have things like issues with sight or hearing. So not that hearing is particularly relevant, but issues with sight. So we do try and cater it for offline audiences in that way. So in between January 2018 and January 2019, we did a mail out. So we sent 26,000 coded registration forms to memory clinics in the UK. So when somebody has dementia symptoms, they get referred to memory clinics at their local hospital. There we had paper registration forms, so people could take them home with them and register to the service. So off the back of that, again, we had about 6% response rate, and over 1,500 people registered to the service. So we are also looking at relaunching that this year in the coming months. So because we work a lot with people that obviously don't have online access, we have a phone service. So we have an information service where people can contact us by phone, and we can provide ongoing support that way. Obviously, the pandemic did hit us quite hard as a team. So because we do try to target places like GP surgeries and memory clinics were completely closed over the pandemic for about 6 to 8 months. Obviously, also a lot of GP appointments shifted to virtually. So we weren't able to kind of reach the same audiences in the same way. And we did notice a massive drop off in the number of people with a dementia diagnosis registering to join dementia research. Obviously, there's no current treatments at the moment which slow or stop the progression of dementia. So it's really important that research recruits people with a dementia diagnosis. There's about 125 drugs at the moment in late stage clinical trials for dementia. So there's a massive kind of backlog between the number of people with a dementia diagnosis and getting them involved in research. So unfortunately, we did see a large drop off in the pandemic of the amount of people signing up to the service, but kind of starting to see those numbers recover now. And there's a couple of things that we're doing to try and boost those numbers. So again, we're going to do a mail out to people with a diagnosis within the last 3 months with a registration form and some information about the service. And we're also looking at implementing GP text messaging, which we found has been quite helpful in the past. So that's where a GP service will send a text to all those in the area that are kind of registered with them with our phone number, so people can call us or they can register themselves online. So yeah, that's kind of the main work streams we're working on.
Thanks very much, Jess. So clearly trying to identify the obvious touch points for dementia patients, GP surgery, memory clinics, that sort of thing, was a key part of your strategy. And what a shame about the pandemic, causing that drop off. But it reassuring, I guess, that your numbers are recovering now, and you're trialing new things like GP text messaging and so on. Okay, could I then move on to our fourth panelist, Polly? Polly, are you there? Brilliant, thanks, Polly. Yeah.
Yes, I'm here. I struggled to get in, but I am here. I've heard all this.
No, absolutely. I saw you earlier on, but I just wanted to make sure you're back on for this.
Okay.
Thanks very much for joining us. Do you want me to repeat the question? Are you happy to go?
No, please just remind me.
Yeah, sure. So please tell us about your recent campaign, which involved bridging the digital divide, including, to the degree that you can, how you determined who is not online and how the pandemic affected the divide.
Okay, so I think for us as a local authority, this issue will always be wider than a single campaign, because our job, part of our job as communicators serving local government, is to build an ongoing relationship with our residents and provide ongoing access to services. And I think one of the things we've learned a lot about the digital divide over the last few years is how much of it is driven by poverty. So we have, we used to sort of, in the olden days, think about the digital divide as being people who didn't know how to use the internet, people who didn't have a PC at home, people who didn't know how to go online. And actually those people are, those people who are digitally excluded in that traditional sense are getting less and less. What we find far more now is people who are perfectly capable of engaging online, but all too often they've run out of data, they don't have access to Wi-Fi, they don't have broadband at home. It's the first bill to go. All our research shows us if you can't afford heating and eating, then the first thing you're going to stop paying if you've got a broadband subscription is that. And so, the kind of unreliability and sort of scant nature of public Wi-Fi, the fact that people, quite often are on pay-as-you-go contracts on their phones, that for us is becoming the key issue in the digital divide. It's can't from a technological point of view, it's can't from a financial point of view. And that's really important to us as a local authority where we have very, very high levels of people living in poverty, as well as a hugely affluent population sitting alongside that. And I think for me, the key learning over the pandemic was realizing, really bringing this home to me. So I'm also responsible, as well as being responsible for communications and so on, I'm also responsible for libraries, heritage and culture. And I took on responsibility for libraries during the pandemic. And one of the things that I found out was that when we went into lockdown and we were forced to shut the libraries, every day there would be crowds of people standing outside the libraries to try and access the Wi-Fi, which we kept switched on. Because the world had moved online and all of our residents were suddenly being expected to do things that some of them had never done before, like online shopping and that kind of thing. And they just didn't have the wherewithal to do it at home. So it really brought home to me how important it is that as a local authority, we provide those spaces where people can access the internet and access digital services for free. And also those are really, really great places to provide digital skills. So, we did a lot. And the other thing we have in Hackney, which is quite unique to us, is an Orthodox Jewish population of between 30 and 40,000 people. And hopefully our census data, when we get the breakdown, will tell us, the size of that population now. But this is a population who have no television, have no radios, and are not allowed to use the internet for anything but the most narrow business purposes. And so that's a different kind of digital divide. These are people who are actively choosing not to access the digital world because of their own religious sensibilities. And lots of places have individuals like that, or sometimes even small communities, but we're talking about a good 10% of our population, 25% of our under 19s are in that community because they're very, very big families. And so in COVID, that was our big, our big challenge was around that community. I remember the day after Boris Johnson announced the lockdown, one of my sort of senior directors came up to me and she said, "What are we going to do about Stamford Hill?" And it was like, because we'd seen reports from similar communities in Israel and New York that infections were running really high, that and we had to work really, really, really hard to make sure the very first things, your old-fashioned back to basics, you put leaflets through doors. And at that point, we had to get police permission to get people to go out and put leaflets through doors, but literally telling everybody in Stamford Hill what happened and what the expectations of them were. I can see you frozen. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I think we're okay.
Okay, fine. Okay, so there's different challenges for us. There are communities that are excluded by poverty. There are, of course, some communities that are excluded by lack of skills. There are communities that are self-excluded by not wanting to engage in the digital sphere. And so, as I said, for us, we do a number of campaigns, and we did a huge campaign in COVID to engage the Orthodox community using a whole range of methodologies, which I can talk through. But they're a very, very specific group of people, and if I was talking to a bunch of people in Williamsburg in New York, they probably really want to hear all the detail because they've got very similar community. And actually, they did really badly in New York engaging their Haredi community during COVID. In fact, they had riots in Williamsburg and Brooklyn, which we didn't have in Stamford Hill, which is great. But we, we've got a whole range of ways of trying to tackle this stuff. Using quite clever use of outdoor advertising. Using door-to-door distribution, which is still so important to us as a local authority. You cannot be putting things through people's doors, particularly when it comes to a call to action. But I think the bigger issue for us is relational, because your digital by default, which is a phrase that used to get used in government a lot, it can be brilliant for customer services. It can be. We've all experienced like applying for a passport online and thought, isn't this so much better than those mad forms in the post office where you're really scared you get your signature outside the box? It's a great thing. And applying for a new driving license, all of these things, they're really, really easy. But when you're a local authority, the more of your stuff, the more of your services that you put into that sphere, every time you do it, you take away an opportunity to have a relational interaction with a resident. So the old lady who used to pop into the council and then phone the council to order recycling bags and so on and have a nice chat with someone will now have very little choice but to go onto our website and do it, which she may find harder or easier depending on what kind of old lady she is. My dad would find it really easy, my mum would struggle, but in the end, every single piece of that interaction that we remove from people's daily lives transactionalizes our relationship with it and with our residents, and can effectively downgrade it when it comes to building trust. So I think it's, we've tried to do a lot of thinking about that, making sure that, and lots of councils have gone fully into digital by default in their communications, not only as well in terms of getting rid of print publications or print means of communications, but also by actually getting rid of having its own channels of their own and relying entirely on social media, which I think as a public body is madness to rely on channels that you don't control effectively for all of your interaction with your residents. And I think the other thing that we found out over recent years is that, and I will wind up 1 minute, sorry, is that if residents want to talk to us about the stuff that really matters to them, they do not want to do it online. And, we did a big thing called the Young Futures Commission, where we engaged around 3,000 young people, talking to them about their lived experience of life in Hackney and so on. And we started the campaign with the assumption that young people want to engage digitally. They didn't. The digital channels we created for that engagement went almost unused. And what young people wanted to do was sit down in rooms with peer researchers and with people that they wanted to talk to and talk to them. And we ended up going to places where they were, like McDonald's and places like that, with, say, fully trained peer researchers and having conversation with people. People do not want to share their lived experience via a digital means. And the other thing, just to finish, because I could go on about this stuff all day, is one of the things we did during COVID is that we worked with a group of local young people in Hackney and Camden to create a toolkit for engaging young people with public health messaging. And we did that, as I say, in a sort of co-produced way. And the toolkit was, it was fantastic, and it ended up being presented to the vaccines minister. And, it was a great thing. But one of the things young people said to us is, don't forget that online isn't the only place we can engage. They gave us lots of good tips about, which Instagram feeds they look at and where to do this and where to do that and which influencers they listen to and don't listen to. But what they also said is, don't overcomplicate things. We're kids. Remember, we listen to our teachers. Remember to come and talk to us. That was a real kind of eye-opener for us. And the listen to our teachers thing meant we ended up creating a curriculum pack about the vaccine for from primary right up to the end of secondary school, for science teachers to deliver in schools, to teach people about the vaccine and about vaccination generally. And that was really powerful. And we did it for schools all across London. We did it as part of Keep London Safe. So it's like those kind of creative channels where you wouldn't ever think of like a curriculum pack as a comms channel. But actually, if you want to talk to young people, they do trust their teachers. I'll stop now. I can go on about this stuff. But it's, as I said, it's much bigger than a campaign for us. But there are campaigns I can talk about if anyone's interested.
Fantastic, Holly. Thank you ever so much. I really like the way you talked about, structuring it so that you understand the differences between lack of access due to poverty or skills or self-exclusion, door-to-door distribution and the power of that. And also not assuming things. It's not about digital for digital's sake. And your example of connecting with younger people and what they actually found useful in terms of effective comms. So again, another fantastic case study and some examples. So what a brilliant panel. I told you they were a brilliant audience, and I hope you agree with me now that they are. Going to crack on. I'm going to reverse the order now. Sorry, Polly. And I'm going to ask each of you in turn, starting with Polly, what your top 3 tips are for bridging the digital divide. Go.
Okay, so my top 3 tips are to I think to go to where people are. Never underestimate the power of conversation. You know, it's become a core part of our comms. We have an engagement-led model of comms, and it's a core part of our comms arsenal now, is we go out into our communities and we talk to people and we listen to them. And whether we're doing formal kind of statutory consultation or just broader engagement, it's about going out into the world and talking to people, and that's really important. I think the second thing is about to not make lazy assumptions about digital exclusion. You know, as I said at the beginning, there aren't a bunch of people who can use the internet, a bunch of people who can't. It's about really understanding and actually researching. And we, you know, in our regular resident survey work we do with Ipsos Mori, we always ask lots of questions about this, so we can really get underneath who those people are and what's driving that digital exclusion. So it's about understanding what's behind it, understanding those audiences. And as I said, and I think that probably the last thing is power of print. Print is excellent, and don't throw the print baby out with the bathwater.
Thank you. Okay, can I ask the same question of Jess? Jess, your top 3 tips.
Yeah, so we definitely say try and establish long-term solutions and how you're going to support these kind of demographics. It's quite easy to kind of maybe do a one-off campaign or initially reach out to certain people, but you need a way to allow them to continue to contact you. Obviously it depends on which sector you're in, but that's really important. And we also think communications should be consistent. I quite often see communications going out to offline audiences where the vast majority of the content talks about online opportunities. You need to make sure that if you're reaching an offline audience, you need to talk about purely offline opportunities. And then finally, kind of what Polly said, making sure resources are brought to people. So whether that's targeting specific communities or targeting specific kind of places of work, then try and make sure that the resources are readily available to the demographics that you're trying to target.
Thank you. Anna?
Right, yeah, I think if I had 3 top tips, I think it would be kind of understand your audience. I think drawing on what others have said, I think there's not, you know, it's not binary, it's not black and white, you know, whether you're online or offline. There are lots of people kind of in the middle, so really important to understand who you're talking to and what channels they're using. So it's not like online channels are totally off the, off the page, but I think think about what channels those people might be using, and then following from that, I think just go to people where they are. So people trust people in their local community, so using things like community marketing. We've done a lot of that, posters up in their local post office, encouraging partnerships with GP surgeries, using local champions, encouraging word of mouth, those kind of things, and including offline channels if they're right. And lastly, kind of people, I think people trust people like them. So particularly when you're trying to encourage behavior change amongst digitally excluded people, they will trust local community champions. They'll trust friends and family members who are supporting and encouraging them. They'll trust like stories of people who have been in a similar boat to them. So those stories about impacts are so important to focus on the impacts and benefits rather than the scary words like digital that really turn people off and really exclude people. So really focus on benefits and the stories of real life individuals.
Thank you, Anna. And Jo?
Yes, lots of similarities and overlaps with what others have said, but I think my top 3 would be, yes, about trying to understand who you're trying to reach as a human, which sounds a bit ridiculous, but people are not defined by whether they are digitally active or otherwise. There's lots of other stuff going on, as Polly mentioned. So I think it's really important to look at people in context. Otherwise, you're going to devise solutions that you think are going to work but actually aren't, because you haven't explored people's underlying motivations and the other things that are going on in their lives, and that does make things a lot more complex. But if you can do it, it does mean that your comms are going to be much richer and more impactful. So that's number one. I think the second thing that really applied to our campaign and activity around census was really carefully thinking through people's user journeys, so how they were going to move through all the interactions, because again, there can be a knee-jerk reaction to say, oh, we've just printed a pile of stuff, or we're running a radio ad, so that's that group covered. But you can throw up kind of higher areas of complexity, and certainly during the pandemic, we were confident that we'd supplied kind of older age groups with paper questionnaires, but then we ran into the difficulty during lockdowns of they were probably the people least likely to want to go out even to a post box. They were also least likely to want to open their door to one of our field support officers who might would have been able to help in terms of completion. So I was trying to think around that and the challenges, and you can only do that if you're thinking about through from beginning to end. And I think the final sort of hint or tip I have is around channels. I'd completely echo Polly's points about the value of print and also of post, because as a kind of backbone to our campaign, we did have a series of postal communications, from an initial postcard saying census is coming, and then a stream of materials alongside all of the kind of mainstream media. The other channel, I think, is really trying to make use of networks. They might be formalized networks working with other charities or organizations who already have connections with particular audiences or groups, or they can be informal networks. So with census, we said, if you've completed your census form, why not help someone else do it who you think might be struggling? And we put that message out to the people who could help, and we also put the message out to people who might need help, that they could look for trusted people to help them with it.
Okay, fantastic. We could go on for ages, couldn't we? I can imagine our participants are scribbling furiously as you've been talking. But let me bring John back in now, because I think what we should try and do is, hi John, thanks. Maybe we can pick up some questions and comments from our audience to see what they're thinking and saying and asking for.
Thank you, Harish. Yes, definitely there have been a few questions coming in, and I think fantastic contributions from everybody on the panel. It's been a great discussion so far. I think one thing that springs to mind instantly off of Joe's last comment and echoes a lot of what Polly said earlier is also not to forget the value of where regulations, pandemic regulations allow, you know, the power of a face-to-face conversation and actually going out to places where groups are gathered. I mean, that's from my own experience working within the Church of England. A lot of our demographic gather at a specific place at a specific time every week, but aren't necessarily, you know, digital natives or feel comfortable using digital channels. So we found that actually getting messages across that way was the best way to do things. Looking at the Q&A panel, there are quite a few questions that have come in so far. I think one really interesting one says, there seems to be a drive towards everything digital. Personally, I am digitally savvy, but won't use digital banking. What about those who do not have the cognitive ability to feel safe using digital technology? So there's really starting to be this dialogue there between, you know, digital competency and access, but then also the ability to feel safe and comfortable using these channels.
Does anyone want to pick that up? That's a great question, isn't it? Because it starts to get into ethics, really, doesn't it? And, you know, what's the responsibility of the banks, for example, in providing alternatives, because we know how insecure it can be. Does anyone have any experience of those sorts of issues?
So I'm happy to kind of jump in quickly on this one. I think you're right. I think there's like a responsibility on the whoever's delivering that service, the bank, or social media platform, for example, to make their platforms, their services as safe as possible. Something we as an organisation, we're kind of closely involved with the online safety bill. We know that our online harms are a real concern for people who are less confident online, and it is a reason that people are wary of doing things online. So I think it's kind of a collective responsibility, but a big responsibility on government to make sure that those places online are safe. But equally, that not everyone will, as the commentator said, not everybody will want to do everything online. So responsibilities of the banks and others to ensure there are face-to-face channels available to people. And I think that's that's a real challenge as they try and cut costs and deliver more efficient services.
I think I'd just chip in on that. I think it goes back to our sort of discussion about really trying to understand people's motives and mindsets, because you might do all kinds of things to encourage someone to engage online, and yet if they've got this kind of deep-seated reservation, or they're not comfortable in that environment, that isn't actually going to help. So you do need to understand what's going on in order to unpick it, and then you might consider that you've got the kind of arguments, material and points that's going to actually reassure them and get them to make that leap, or that isn't actually going to happen. And then you're looking at the kind of alternative provision that you can make that we've spoken about in terms of face-to-face interactions or post, or however else it is you've set it up, because I don't think we're ever going to get to a situation where you have 100% of people happily and actively and constantly dealing with all their transactions online.
Can I come in here? I think the point that the questioner made about people's cognitive ability is really important, and again, this is something that I have learned since I took over the library service, is how important it is for people who possibly have some sort of learning disability or lower levels of education or a lack of confidence to be able to access help, because I think for a lot of things now, like for example universal credit applications, there isn't a choice for people. There is, and I personally, I think this is terrible. I think there should always be an alternative for the people who need it, but Her Majesty's government don't agree. And so the amount of people that come into our libraries wanting help with those basic tasks, like how I can access my benefits and so on, is absolutely huge. And that's really grown since the pandemic, because so much more stuff has gone online, so much more has gone down that digital by default route, and things just aren't coming back to normal. And so I think that somehow we need, and obviously the work that the charities here to do today represent is really important, but I think it, and I make a vaguely political point here, is that since 2010, since austerity, 800 libraries have shut in the UK, and every single one of those places is a potential touch point for bridging the digital divide, where people can go in, they can use PCs, they can get access to help, just do the basic things that everyone needs to be able to do to run their lives now. So I think there has to be a real social effort in how do we replicate that. Nobody's going to go and reopen 800 libraries. It's just not going to happen much as I might want it to. But people want to sit down with a person, they want to be shown how to do it. And I think it's really important not to underestimate how difficult people find this stuff. There's a lot of research that shows that people who aren't confident in digital space can gain some confidence, but only on a particular device. And if you try and change that, it's like they're like, I can do this on my iPad, or I can do this on my computer at home. If they go into a different environment and it looks different, and we learned this the hard way, because as an organisation we took the whole organisation over to G Suite. And so all the computers in our public PCs in our library were suddenly a Google environment instead of a Windows environment. And pretty much all of those users went into a meltdown, because even just the browser, the internet browser, looking different from what they were used to, even though the functionality is exactly the same, was too much for them to be able to deal with. They're like, it's changed, I can't do it anymore. And I think really understanding how hard people find this stuff is really important. And in the end, the lack of society's willingness to support this stuff ends up with local authorities to deal with, because it always does. So there you go.
So I think there's another couple of questions that I'd like to try and squeeze in. One particularly, which is a really interesting, takes the discussion into a really different direction that we haven't really covered too much. But it says, what experiences and suggestions do the panel have for reaching internal staff who are digitally excluded or people who are not computer-based?
Can I come back in on that? Because this is the perennial problem for internal communications in local authorities, because we have, and actually particularly for an authority like Hackney, where we have politically, it's really important to our administration that we insource services. So lots of councils will have outsourced a lot of the frontline work, but we haven't. It's really important to us that our BIM men and our care workers and, you know, those people out on the front line are part of our organisation. But reaching them is really, really difficult. There is, you know, lots and lots of internal communications relies on email, huge, or stuff that's distributed electronically. And there is no easy answer. It has to be done in a labour-intensive way. You know, your chief executive has to go down to the bin depot at 5:30 in the morning, preferably with a big tray of bacon sandwiches, and talk to people face to face. That, you know, you can give them access to technology. There's no reason on God's earth why they can't access this stuff on their smartphones, because they've all got them, but they don't want to. That's like they're engaged with the organisation in a completely different way. They're very task focused. They're not that interested in the corporate body. What they are interested in is doing a good job for residents. And actually, the only way to interact effectively with staff on the front line, as I said, is to go out and see them. Yeah, you can give them paper copies of staff surveys, and you can incentivise them with football tickets and stuff to fill them in. But nothing, you know, nothing can replace the power of, you know, first of all, of good line management communication, which is really hard to get right in a big organisation, but also visible leadership, going out and talking to people and listening to them. So that's not rocket science, but it is the only way to do it.
Just to add something on that, I think you know, we talk about like the digitally excluded population, and like things like, you know, claiming their universal credit or doing universal job match or whatever isn't going to be the thing that makes them value digital. It's the thing that they're being forced to do online, and if anything, it's likely to turn them off. And the really hard thing about digital exclusion is like everybody has an individual motivation that will get them, that will excite them about digital, whether it's, you know, Skyping with friends and family, or, you know, benefiting from comparison sites or shopping online, but they'll be really individual. So it's not that there's one easy answer to say, oh, you can just sell this one benefit to them and that's what will get everybody. And so it really is quite intensive and quite hard to get those people online. So I think you can force them to do a task online, or encourage them to do a task online, but that won't necessarily mean that they're fully included and skilled individual. I think it's much more complicated to kind of get them to that position.
And I think, sorry, I think that's a really important point. And I think also there are so many different levels of digital inclusion. And yeah, my mum, she would describe herself as technologically incompetent. She can use Facebook and she loves looking at things on the internet, but she any kind of transaction she just can't do. She's just terrified of it, you know, so I have to do it all for her, like buying plane tickets and stuff, but because she's terrified she'll pocket up or accidentally give all her money away or something like that. And to be honest, I'm quite glad she feels like that because it's safer, but it doesn't mean that she isn't quite happy using Facebook or watching YouTube or whatever. And it's not black and white. There's all kinds of levels of that. And I don't think you're right. I don't think a DWP form is going to attract anybody into the online world.
Just looking at the time, I think we are now running at time. So I think I'm going to draw the discussion to a close there. That's a great point to end on. Thank you to all of our panelists and to Harish for chairing the discussion. I think if everyone found it as insightful and interesting and fascinating as I did, then we've all got a lot of food for thought over the next period. wanting to just remind everybody who is attending, who is a member of CIPR, that you can log your points, your CPD points, for your CPD qualifications. Again, the session will be online. The recording will be online probably within the next couple of days. And if you haven't, please make sure you've signed up for our newsletter. It's fairly straightforward. You just go on to the website and subscribe. That way you can stay up to date with the latest on everything that's happening with the not-for-profit group at CIPR. So thank you once again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. If you're in England, I hope you're managing to stay cool, or as cool as possible. Thank you again. Take care. Bye-bye.